in Joyce's writing and in Ireland, in the Ireland of his era, for a long time. A lot of what might be common knowledge to me might not be common knowledge to you, so I thought I'd start with a sort of brief summary of Joyce's life. And you see, there he is. That is a photograph of James Joyce at the age of 6. He was born James Augustine Aloysius Joyce in the Dublin suburb of Rathgar on February 2nd, 1882, which I love because it's, of course, St. Bridget's Day, and it's also Groundhog Day. He was the second but eldest surviving child of a very large middle-class Catholic family. So as the family grew and his father's income became more unstable for all kinds of reasons, life in the Joyce household became increasingly precarious and impoverished. So he sort of had the best of the Joyce family fortunes, and his younger siblings increasingly kind of got a lot less attention. There were a dozen Joyce children in his family, but only 10 of them survived infancy, which is pretty common in that era. If you've read A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which is largely autobiographical, right? You've learned quite a bit then about his early life. The protagonist of Portrait of the Artist, kind of Joyce's alter ego, Stephen Dedalus, is of course also a major character in the novel Ulysses. And Joyce was educated by the Christian Brothers and the Jesuits and graduated from what was then known as the Royal University. And I think they mentioned this in the film, and if you've read The Dead, right, that's where Gabriel Conroy also, teaches. It became University College Dublin in 1908, I think. So Joyce graduated there just before the name change in 1902. And then he thought he was going to go to Paris and study medicine. So I often think about what the world would have been like if James Joyce had decided, instead of literature, to be a doctor, if any of us would have ever heard of him. But it didn't work out all that well. And he gave up on his medical studies pretty quickly and returned to Dublin to be with his dying mother, who passed away in 1903. And if you've read Ulysses, this pretty much tracks with what happens in Ulysses. In 1904, Joyce turned his ambitions fully toward literature, beginning work on the stories that would be published as Dubliners a decade later in 1914. And Joyce had difficulties publishing nearly all of his work due to censorship. There was a great deal of objection over the morality of his subjects and the difficulties of his writing, right, of modernist experimentation in his prose. But all along the way, Joyce found supporters who recognized his genius. And one of those was William Butler Yeats, the poet and probably leading figure of the Irish literary revival, who sent Ezra Pound, the poet, one of Joyce's early poems when Joyce was only about 20 years old. And Yeats also introduced him to Lady Augusta Gregory, who I noticed got a shout out in the film, Yeats's patron and collaborator, who offered Joyce some support in his pursuit of a medical degree. And this was when Joyce was only about 21 years old, so he had quite a very high level of connections in Dublin, in the Dublin literary world. These were really extraordinary times for literature in Dublin. But Joyce was somewhat skeptical of the Irish Revival's cultural nationalist project, and I think you can, in the film, you've got the kind of clash between Gabriel Conroy and Miss Ivors along the lines of their cultural nationalism, and I think Joyce had a similar kind of reticence about the projects. And I think part of that had to do with the fact that the Irish Revival was largely the creation of Protestant Anglo-Irish ascendancy kind of figures like Yeats and Lady Gregory, who were really immersed in the establishment of the Irish literary theater in those early years. And then that ultimately led to the creation, the foundation of the Abbey Theater in 1904. So 1904 was a really big year for Joyce as well. And we're here today to celebrate the events that are commemorated as Bloomsday, 16 June 1904. Joyce decides to leave Dublin for the continent, to go back to Paris. His mother has died. And he decides to try his luck as a language teacher in the fall of 1904. He takes with him a young woman he had met the previous June. Nora Barnacle was a 20-year-old chambermaid at Finn's Hotel in Dublin. She had newly arrived in Dublin from Galway when she meets Joyce. She agreed to leave Ireland with him without benefit of clergy, as the old saying goes. They did not marry. And there's the family. Nora would be his lifelong companion and inspiration, the mother of his 2 children, and ultimately his wife, but not until 1931. They leave Ireland together in 1904 and live together. In 1931, they married in a civil ceremony in London in order to secure the inheritance rights for their 2 children. After leaving Ireland at the age of 22, Joyce lived in a dizzying number of locations on the continent for the rest of his life. And he returned to Dublin only 3 times between 1904 and his final visit in 1912, which I think is really remarkable when you consider that, that all of the works that we know Joyce for, everything, the way that he writes about Ireland and with such intimacy, such detail, all of that happened from memory, largely after 1912. The family flees France, where they were living. They were living in Paris in 1940, and due to the invasion of the Nazis, they returned to Zurich, Switzerland, where they had lived previous to that. They lived all over Europe, and he dies in January of 1941 at the age of 58, and so that's their memorial in Zurich, in the Switzerland in Zurich. And the Irish government refused to repatriate his returns, and part of that had to do with the fact that Europe was at war. But attempts to do so have continued on unsuccessfully for a number of years. As recently as 2019, the Dublin Council was trying to see if they could get Joyce's bones back to Ireland. But Nora and Giorgio, their son, are both buried also in Zurich. And I think it seems kind of fitting that they will just stay there. I don't think there's any chance of them repatriating his remains at this point. So I want to pause for a moment. Let me give you, oh, there you go. I'm going to pause for a moment and talk a little bit about Dublin in 1904. So Dublin at this time is the 2nd city of the British Empire, the most English of Irish cities, and it's, of course, a port city. And I think that's really significant to Joyce and to our reading of his work. And the critic Nicholas Allen has argued in his book, Sea Tangled, which is just an astonishing collection of essays, that coastlines are contact zones with the world at large, where national borders and identities are ephemeral, and that there's an energy in those fluid spaces that mark the borders of nations. And the economic life of Ireland depended upon the flux of colonial commerce. And Joyce's Dubliners, Allen argues, sort of traces Joyce's fascination with England's decline and the declining maritime supremacy that Ireland experiences, that Ireland and England experiences in the first years of the 20th century. So in 1904, Queen Victoria is dead for 3 years. Edward VII, her son, is now the King of Britain and Ireland. Irish nationalism is on the rise in Dublin. The labor unions are on the rise. We heard some references to that in the film. And both the cultural nationalism that's fueling the literary revival and the revolutionary nationalism that eventually fuels the 1916 Easter Rising and the War of Independence in the 1920s, right, ultimately leads to the formation of the Irish Free State and the partition of Northern Ireland in 1922, and then the Civil War in 1923. And I think Joyce's Ulysses and much of his work really captures Dublin in 1904 on the cusp of these major social and political changes. So Dublin is a really small city relative to London and Paris, but it's the largest city in Ireland, and it's a place of new ideas and potentials for the future. But it's also a place where someone who's young, like Joyce, might find kind of overbearing and stagnant. And I think we see him kind of playing with these kind of contradictory ideas about what Dublin was like in 1904, especially in the Stories of Dubliners, which I know some of you read for a talk last night. So Ireland in 1904, I think, can be seen as both this kind of parochial backwater and priest-ridden and middle class, and but it's also this kind of cauldron of intellectual energy and innovation, and I think we see these these things here. So Stephen, having left in 1904, Stephen Dedalus, in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, states really famously that he's going to fly by the nets of nation and language and religion to forge in the smithy of his soul the uncreated conscience of his race. And I love this New Yorker cartoon. You get James Joyce's refrigerator, call the bank and go to the dry cleaners and forge in the smithy of your soul the uncreated conscience of your race. Joyce, I'm going to argue, had a complicated relationship with Irish nationalism, and that's something that we see him revisit in a lot of his work, and something we'll talk about in relation to the dead a little bit later in my talk. He took Irish language lessons from the Irish revolutionary and Easter Rising martyr Pádraig Pearse when he was a university student. And many scholars have noted, though, that they butted heads, right? Because Pádraig Pearse really deplored the idea that an Irish writer would use anything except the Irish language to write. And Joyce very much disapproved of that. But Joyce had learned Irish through classes with the Gaelic League as a teenager as well. So he did, in fact, actually have a pretty good command of contemporary Irish and of ancient Irish. And a lot of those words appear in Finnegan's Wake as well, right? So he's an extraordinary language scholar. Okay, so with this background in mind, I'm going to turn my attention a little bit to the women in Joyce's life and the role of women in his life and in his fiction. The critic Brenda Maddox notes that in every book except A Portrait, the last words are spoken by a woman. In The Dead, which we just watched the film of, Greta says, oh, the day I heard that he was dead. And those are the last spoken words in The Dead. As we know, there's a lot of internal thoughts that are represented, Gabriel's thoughts. But Greta has the last word. And in Ulysses and in Finnegan's Wake, the entire closing monologues, down to the final utterances in the books, are in the female voice. So if Joyce was a little ambivalent and maybe contradictory in his portrayal of turn-of-the-century Dublin, his attitudes toward women, I'm going to argue, were equally complicated. And one of the questions that students often ask me about Joyce is if he's a feminist. And of course, that's a tricky question because it involves defining what it means for someone who was born in 1882 and died in 1941 to be a feminist. But I would say no, that Joyce was not a feminist. He was not someone who worked in any concerted way to support women's political or economic equality, right? He wasn't active in suffrage, support of suffrage movements. He wasn't political in that way. But I'm going to also make the claim, that he was fascinated by women, and I'm going to say, too, though, that he also, one of the reasons why I would say he doesn't really earn the right to be kind of called a feminist is because he sort of very famously kind of denounces women as less intellectual than men. He wrote to his friend Frank Budgeon, the artist, you have never heard of a woman who was the author of a complete philosophic system. No, and I don't think you ever will. So he's sort of, so he also wrote to his contemporary, the Irish literary critic and author Mary Colum, I hate intellectual women. That's not great. Taken at face value, it's pretty damning. But Richard Ellman, Joyce's biographer, still probably arguably the best biographer of Joyce, provides the context for this claim. Joyce was, Ellman argues, complaining to Mary Colum specifically about Gertrude Stein. So, and Stein had been critical of Joyce's achievements in Ulysses, and there was some professional rivalry and jealousy there. So I can imagine Mary Colum, who was a co-founder of the Irish Review, a Trinity University graduate, and a major Irish intellectual woman herself, rolling her eyes at Joyce's outburst. She was apparently not offended, though, because she and her husband, the writer and critic Pádraig Colum, were lifelong friends to James Joyce. And Mary vigorously defended Joyce's literary reputation until her own death in 1957. So for all of Joyce's sort of spleen and claiming that he hates intellectual women, many intellectual women, as I'm going to talk about today, were incredibly important to Joyce's personal and professional success. So I tell my students that from my perspective, even if Joyce is not someone we might comfortably call a feminist, his writing reveals him to be unusually empathetic to women, and his work shows deep insight into the social and religious pressures placed on women in his era. He's deeply critical of the limited role that women have within Irish culture, so maybe he's a little bit of a feminist. What I can say definitively, though, is that Joyce's work would not be read today and might not exist at all if it were not for the women in his life who supported him both emotionally and financially. And I'm going to introduce you briefly to some of those women and then talk a little bit more about how Joyce represents women in some of his work. Sorry, this is, we'll figure it out. Okay, so this is Harriet Shaw Weaver, if I can make this, it's not, oh wait. Here we go. Harriet Shaw Weaver is the first woman I want to mention. She was a British heiress, a suffragist, a feminist, a writer and editor of the Egoist literary magazine. And she was introduced to Joyce by Ezra Pound. Pound is everywhere. Like, he's the subject for another day, I suppose. Harriet Shaw Weaver immediately became Joyce's champion and patron. She paid many of Joyce's bills. From 1916 onward, Joyce was always living a little higher than he should in Europe and always getting into some trouble and never had enough money. But she was often bailing him out. And she also paid the cost of his funeral in 1941. She first supported Joyce by serializing in the Egoist magazine a portrait of the artist as a young man. And then in 1916, and the Egoist published it in 25 parts between February of 1914 and September of 1915. And she paid Joyce £50 for the work, which would be about £6,500 in today's money. So a decent bit of money for him to live on. And it said that she probably gave him somewhere in the neighborhood of £1 million over the course of his life, and that they blew through that money. So Weaver established the Egoist Press. And imagine this, having a supporter who supports you so much that not only does she publish your work in her magazine, she creates an imprint. She actually starts a publishing house literally to publish your work. And the Egoist Press edition of Portrait of the Artist was published at her own expense. And the Egoist magazine would later also serialize 3.5 episodes of Ulysses, and then published the first full English edition of the novel in 1922, which had to be printed in France because of charges of obscenity against the novel. This was rough for Harriet Shaw Weaver because the US Post Office had burned as many as 500 imported copies of the Egoist edition of Ulysses, so that was a lot of money down the drain. And the return on her significant emotional and financial investment in Joyce was sometimes rocky. But throughout Joyce's life, Harriet Shaw Weaver was a deeply loyal supporter and patron. And he made her the literary executor of his work. And so she was the one who made the decision to give all of his manuscript materials prior to Finnegan's Wake to the National Library of Ireland, where they are today. And a lot of the works then Finnegan's Wake ends up going to the British Library because after Joyce's death, the failure of the Irish government to repatriate his remains kind of stuck in Nora and Giorgio's craw, right, his son. So they decided they did not want the National Library of Ireland to have Finnegan's Wake, so the British Library has it. Okay, there are 3 American women who would also prove to be enormously influential in the production of Ulysses. Here we go. Here's 2 of them. Oh, if I can make my slides work. Maybe. Oh, there they are. Okay, Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap. Margaret Anderson was the founder, editor, and publisher of the Little Review, and Jane Heap was one of her editors and her partner in business and in love for a time. And they were forced to defend the Little Review's serialization in the United States of Ulysses against obscenity charges. They were fined $100, which was about $1,800 today. And they were ordered by the court to cease publication of the novel. So there's the Little Review. It's not the one that, it's not actually the edition that Ulysses is in, but it's a good old copy of it. So here's a quote from the Morgan Library website about it. They said, the first of 23 installments of Ulysses appeared in the Little Review in March 1918. Between 1919 and 1920, the U.S. Postal Service confiscated 4 issues because they violated the Comstock Act, which prohibited the distribution by mail of matter, printed matter deemed obscene. And the issue containing an excerpt from the Nausicaa episode of Ulysses, which is somewhat notorious, right, provoked a court case against the editors, Anderson and Heap. So not just against Joyce, but against Anderson and Heap for being the publishers of the Little Review. And the offending passages, right, in Nausicaa, as many of you know, are Leopold Bloom, masturbates on a beach, watching Gertie McDowell, who's a young woman who has kind of indulged him by leaning back and raising her skirts. Lawyer John Quinn sort of argued that Ulysses could not be obscene because it was unintelligible, because the average reader couldn't understand it, which is kind of fantastic, right? And it's a terrible legal argument, and it doesn't fly, it doesn't work. And that made things really difficult for Joyce, though. So it was banned in the United States and in England, but not in France, where, as many of you will know, here we go, James Joyce met Sylvia Beach, another expatriate American lesbian and owner of the Paris bookstore Shakespeare and Company. And she was the first to publish the first full edition of Ulysses in 1922. So for 2 years, from 1920 to 1922, she worked really closely with Joyce on corrections and additions to the manuscript. And you can imagine a book as long and complicated and experimental as Ulysses would be really difficult to proofread and edit. So that every time a new edition of Ulysses comes out, there's always a concern about errors. And then there's a lot of critical debate about different editions of Ulysses. But this was the first one to finally appear, and it appeared on Joyce's birthday, February 2nd, 1922, which was a really big year for modernism, because it's the same year that T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland is published, and Jacob's Room by Virginia Woolf. So all kinds of really important things happened in 1922. And Beach was hoping that the notoriety surrounding Ulysses would bring fame and prosperity to Shakespeare and Company, but it almost bankrupted her. That long process of correcting proofs and censorship of the novel made it really hard. Without the support, and this is the first American edition of the novel would not appear until Random House printed the first U.S. edition in 1934. So I want to think about how long that is from 1922 to 1934 to not have your work essentially allowed to be published or distributed in your major markets, right? Where your major readership would be. But then Judge John Woolsey, had a famous kind of opinion lifting the customs ban, and the Random House edition prints that along with the novel. So without the support of these really extraordinary intellectual women, Harriet Shaw Weaver and Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap and Sylvia Beach, Joyce might never have published Ulysses. It might never have happened. But I'm going to argue that the woman who is without a doubt the most important to the construction of Ulysses is Joyce's partner and wife, Nora Barnacle Joyce. Nora was only 20 years old in October 1904 when she did what Eveline and Dubliners could not do, right? She walked the gangplank of the big black mass of a ship bound for Liverpool and then onward to the continent with a man who was not yet her husband, leaving behind her family in Galway, who did not know she was leaving Ireland until she was already gone. So she took some moxie. She was extraordinary. And she left her job, which meant that she had to fully rely on the good intentions and economic potential of James Joyce, who was 22 years old and had no money and very few contacts. But he was chasing teaching jobs with the Berlitz Language School across Italy and Switzerland. And their life in Europe was marked by poverty and a lot of relocations, especially during this time, really until Harriet Shaw Weaver kind of shows up in 1916 with money and support. But Nora is an incredibly important factor. I think it's her speech patterns and her turns of phrase and her folk tales and the autobiographical stories and her sexual adventures that fill Joyce's work. She's without a doubt his biggest source of inspiration, and she's his model for many of the women that we meet in his stories. She's the source behind both Greta Conroy in The Dead and Molly Bloom in Ulysses. And if you just watched the film version of The Dead, you've seen Greta talking about this young boy who died, Michael Fury, and her great kind of grief at his loss. And these are stories that were yanked straight from Nora Barnacle's life. Unlike Molly Bloom, though, Nora was, by all reports, deeply faithful to James Joyce. Molly is famously not faithful to her husband, but Nora was very faithful to James Joyce, as far as we know. And it was a really and he was to her as well. And so it was a really remarkable partnership. She was born in March 1884. And according to her biographer, Brenda Maddox, right, she was irretrievably urban for all that she came from Galway. So we have this idea of the west of Ireland as this kind of rural space. But Brenda Maddox makes a point that she was actually a city girl. And she says, this is a quote, she said, she was a city girl, street smart, with a ribbon in her hair, a sharp tongue in her head, and an uncle in the civil service. All the events of her early life took place within the narrow confines of the center of Galway. So moving from the middle of Galway, even in 1904, to the middle of Dublin was not a big stretch for someone with Nora's sense of self. And that biography that is subtitled The Real Life of Molly Bloom, and it came out a very long time ago now, in 1988, but it's still, I think, an incredible treasure. It's well worth reading if you want to know more about Joyce and about Nora's life. And I think it's really interesting because Richard Ellman, who had published the biography of Joyce in I want to say it was 1982, I think, toward the end of his life and his career, had told Brenda Maddox, there's not a whole lot there. There's not a lot to know about Nora. And he changed his mind, right? Because Maddox started interviewing everybody who had ever had any connection at all to the Barnacle family and to the Joyce family. And there were still a lot of people in the 1980s, we're talking 50 years after their deaths, who were still around, who had first-person memories of these people, and or secondhand memories within the family. And so it was really important to capture that, and she did. And Maddox writes about Nora, and Ellman came to appreciate that, and actually really, she thanks Ellman a lot for his help before he died in 1987. He never got to see the book about Nora in print because he died the year before. But Maddox writes that Nora is important because she belonged to Joyce and because she never did. She was the stronger of the two, an independent spirit who had far more influence on him than he upon her, which is quite a claim. And I think there's actually a lot of evidence for that claim in the life and in his works. So Stephen Joyce, who was Nora and James's only grandchild, who died in 2020, and that was the end of that line of the family, right? There are no Joyce descendants at this point, direct descendants, said, Nona was so strong, she was a rock. I would venture to say that he could have done none of it, not written one of the books without her. So Ulysses takes place on 16 June 1904, which commemorates their first date and is, as is widely reported, their first sexual encounter as well. One of the things that Joyce finds most inspirational in Nora is her frank and free enjoyment of sex. And if you want to know more about that part of their lives, you can read their letters. I'm not going to quote those letters today. Nora gave birth to their son Giorgio in June of 1905, almost exactly 9 months after their arrival in Europe. And 2 years later, she gave birth to their daughter Lucia. And life with Joyce was an emotional and economic struggle, and they were perpetually in debt. And Joyce suffered from both alcoholism and severe vision loss. So there was a lot that they had to manage. So I'm going to see. There she is. Okay, so women in Joyce's early works. I'll talk a little bit about that. When we think about the women in a portrait and in the stories of Dubliners, they're often kind of viewed obliquely or at a distance or in these kind of liminal spaces. And often from the point of view of men who are given the bulk of the narrative interest and attention. But Joyce, as a writer, never lets us forget the fact that we are seeing the women through the filter of the male gaze. And I think that's really interesting and important for us to understand. So I'm going to say, I'm going to give you as an example the really famous passage in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where Stephen Dedalus has this incredible epiphany that's triggered by this young woman that he sees on a beach, right? This unnamed, unknown young woman. And this is, I'm not going to read all of it, but I'll show you some of it. This idea of this girl who stood before him in midstream, alone and still, gazing out to sea. She seemed like one whom magic had changed into the likeness of a strange and beautiful seabird. And he describes her lyrically and beautifully. And then we find out she was alone and still, gazing out to sea. And when she felt his presence and the worship of his eyes, her eyes turned to him in quiet sufferance of his gaze, without shame or wantonness. Long, long she suffered his gaze, and then quietly withdrew her eyes from his and bent them toward the stream, gently stirring the water with her foot hither and thither. And so we get this scene where we have this young woman, and all of a sudden, this experience of seeing her, gives Stephen's soul cries out, "Heavenly God," in an outburst of profane joy, right? He turned away from her suddenly and set off across the strand. Her image had passed into his soul forever, and no word had broken the holy silence of his ecstasy. Her eyes had called him, and his soul had leaped at the call. To live, to err, to fall, to triumph, to recreate life out of life. A wild angel had appeared to him, the angel of mortal youth and beauty, an envoy from the fair courts of life, to throw open before him in an instant of ecstasy the gates of all the ways of error and glory, on and on and on and on. Wow. So all of that happens, and more happens, right? And there I have a little, another one of the J.J. Clark pictures of children playing on a beach. I was trying to find a picture of a girl looking out to sea by herself, but this was the best I could do today. From the National Collection. Life during 1904 is kind of the J.J. Clark National Library of Ireland collection has a lot of photographs that you can find on their website that will show you Dublin in 1904. But prior to this, ecstatic encounter with the young woman, right? Stephen was going to be a priest, right? He was going to dedicate his life to the church. But then he has this encounter with this woman on the beach, this girl, this seabird-like girl. And he decides he's going to be an artist. He's going to recreate life out of life, and it turns him toward a different future. But what happens to our bird-like young woman, stirring the sand with her foot and gazing out to sea? And what are her thoughts and dreams and desires? We will never know, right? She suffers Stephen's aestheticizing gaze and does not speak. She is reduced to symbol for him, becoming a reflection of his own desires for his future. And the faint flame that trembles on her cheek sets his cheeks ablaze and his body aglow, and that's, the quotes from the passage. But then he immediately turns and runs away from her. which is a little bit comic, right? Her image is tucked away in his mind. He got all he needed from that encounter. So her flesh and blood existence is of no consequence then. Once she's past this flame of inspiration to him, that kind of blush on her cheek becomes like, his body aglow. And then he runs away, inspired. So we see Stephen's ability to abstract art from the material, physical presence of this young woman. And we can also appreciate, though, that for her, Stephen's gaze is an intrusion, right? Something she must suffer. Literally the word suffer, suffering, right? She has to suffer his gaze. And it's something, Stephen's presence brings with it social and sexual danger to this young woman. She thinks she's alone on the beach. She's hiked her skirts up to avoid getting them wet. She's looking out to sea when Stephen approaches from behind her. And she's got to negotiate the desires of this unknown young man when she has revealed parts of her body that would normally be hidden, right? Respectfully. She would, she's got her skirts all hiked up. She's had her own sea reverie broken, right? So whatever she was thinking, she's not thinking it anymore. Now she's thinking about how to get out of the danger that Stephen represents, we can presume, right? And we know this because Joyce has written this scene in such a way that her discomfort is evident in that word suffer and in the blush that suffuses her skin, right? So we know that she's a person with a body. We know that she's not just a seabird or an angel or a muse. So we know this because Joyce wants us to see that and not just see Stephen seeing her. So Stephen running away is kind of a little bit comic. And we understand then that he's somewhat ignorant and inexperienced, right? We've seen earlier in a portrait his disgust at his own sexual encounters with prostitutes, so a different kind of objectifying of women and women's bodies. But really, even in this sort of aesthetic ecstasy that he experiences on the beach that he runs away from, or runs away with, women are still objects and not subjects to Stephen. But Joyce gives the reader, if not Stephen, right, some insight into the young woman's agency because she stirs the sand with her feet, and we imagine that she's pondering what to do about this young man. Like, okay, this situation, is lingering here. I see him staring at me. What am I going to do? And we get that. So Joyce then leaves her and follows Stephen as he runs off to a career as an artist. So there's an authorial self-awareness in Joyce's portrayal of Stephen's ignorance of women and their desires, and in his ability to recognize and share with the reader the social and religious forces that would limit someone like Stephen's ability to see women as anything beyond being a tool that he can use. So Joyce often depicts men placing women on a pedestal as a symbol, or denigrating them as prostitutes, right? We see him kind of playing with this, the way that men do this in his culture. And we see the pattern repeat, I think, in Araby and Dubliners, right, where you get the young boy in the throes of his first adolescent crush who idealizes his friend Mangan's older sister. If you've read Araby recently, some of you read it, I think, for last night's discussion, he sees the image of the boy and his friends are out on the streets playing at dusk, and Mangan's sister comes to the doorway, and so in the gloom of the night, right, she would be backlit by the interior lights of the house, and she's in this doorway, and she's essentially this black void of a figure yelling at the boys to come in and eat their dinner, but she's sort of framed by this halo of light. So she's sort of like the Virgin Mary. And it's a really hard thing, I think, for the boy in Araby, because it's really difficult to have this sexual awakening and then have your reference point be the Virgin Mary. You're not supposed to think sexual thoughts about the Virgin Mary. But Mangan's sister has been busy in the house. She's the one who will not be able to go across town to the Araby Bazaar because she has to attend a prayer retreat at her convent school. And she's very irritated by it. Joyce lets us see that irritation. But our gallant young knight, right, this boy who falls in love with her and the image of her, even though he doesn't know her and barely speaks to her, he's going to hold her image like a chalice through a throng of foes, right? He imagines himself as a kind of courtly lover who's going to go to the Araby Bazaar and bring this perfect lady back, some token of his esteem, and, like a holy grail from the East. And of course, all of these ideas are drawn from his reading of medieval quest romances and from Catholic dogma. And so we can see the role that literature has in shaping a reader's gendered expectations, and Joyce is well aware of that. And then he arrives at the Araby Bazaar and he sees a bored young saleswoman flirting with two Englishmen, and our young hero suffers, anguish and anger and awareness of the falseness of women and the uselessness of the trinkets at the bazaar and what the English have brought over to sell to the Irish, and like everything kind of falls apart for him and the crush dissolves. But Joyce lets us see the prison that holds Mangan's sister as tightly as any fairy tale tower ever held a captive princess, right? She's caught in the gendered nets of domestic duty and religious restriction. And she's very much like Eveline, who we see who's a little bit older than her in Dubliners, who cannot summon the will to break from the cultural forces that expect her to sacrifice her life for the good of her reputation and her abusive father and her younger siblings, right? Eveline's sailor boyfriend, Frank, which is such a great name, right? How could he not be trustworthy? His name is Frank. But no, he's not particularly trustworthy. She's really caught between a rock and a hard place because in that story, on one hand, she has the abuse that she's suffering at home in this dusty house that she has to manage for her younger siblings, and the rigid morals of her Catholic upbringing. But we know that Frank has also not offered to marry her before they leave, in the same way that Joyce did not offer to marry Nora, was not going to marry Nora before they got on the boat. So Nora gets on the boat and leaves with James Joyce in 1904. But Eveline famously, right, does not. She's caught and paralyzed in one of the most poignant moments in Dubliners. She can't move. And I think that tells us a lot about what Joyce understood about the forces that were at work on women of his era. Greta Conroy, right, similarly abstracted and aestheticized by the men in The Dead. We see Greta through her husband's eyes, and we saw this in the wonderful scene in the film, which actually lingers on her a great deal. And what we don't get in the film is Gabriel's thoughts, which we get in the story, where he says, she looks like a painting. She looks like she should be called Distant Music. And it's a title that kind of removes agency from Greta. It sort of freezes her in his objectifying gaze, and it kind of reduces her to this sort of superficial and generalized symbol. And the meaning of what he's seeing is lost on Gabriel, right? And we do see that in the film. Like, he does not understand that hearing the Lass of Aughrim has brought back Michael Fury, after all of these many years. And so we find this out, later when they're at the Gresham Hotel. But at that point in the story, we don't know either. But we've seen Gabriel in the story is very uncertain about his wife. He's uncertain about women in general. He's very insecure. He makes jokes at her expense about how it took her 3 mortal hours to dress for the party. And he thinks to himself, which is not in the film but is in the story, right, about his mother's suspicions that Greta is a social climber, that Greta has come from the country, from Galway, which, like as we pointed out with Nora, is a city, small city, but a city, but that she might be country cute, right, with this idea of her being cunning. And Greta's like, yeah, but no, that can't, Gabriel thinks, that can't be true, and yet it's the thought that's in his mind is that maybe Greta isn't quite good enough for him. I think when you watch the film and when you read the story, you think maybe he wasn't quite good enough for Greta. He's very destabilized by her sudden excitement at the prospect of visiting Galway with Molly Ivors. So I think we get that in Joyce. Joyce had said he was going to write Dubliners. He said, my intention was to write a chapter of the moral history of my country, and I chose Dublin for the scene because that city seemed to me the center of paralysis. I have tried to present it to the indifferent public under 4 of its aspects: childhood, adolescence, maturity, and public life. And he says, I have written it for the most part in a style of scrupulous meanness. And he had a hard time getting it published, as is just a pattern with Joyce. And he worked on it for 10 years before it finally found a publisher. And it's understandable, right? Because the stories were controversial for their depictions of drunkenness, violence, child abuse, lawlessness, sexual licentiousness, and other unsavory human behavior. Joyce used the real names of Dublin locations and shops and pubs and things, so that made publishers really nervous that they'd be sued. And Joyce submitted the stories 18 times to 15 publishers, trying to get them published. And so he thought he had a deal in 1905 with a London publishing house who said, we'll publish it if you take the Two Gallants story out, which he agreed to do, but then they backed out anyway. They were like, no, we can't publish any of this. And Monsell and Roberts of Dublin agreed to publish it in 1909, but they were so angered by the stories that the printers burned the printing sheets. And the only reason we have Dubliners today is because Joyce managed to save a single copy of the page proofs. And you got to imagine what this was like, right, in that era, how hard it would be to have copies of things. You couldn't just take them over to the photocopier. You couldn't, you had to print them out. So they were finally published. It was finally published by Grant Richards in 1914. So many of the battles that Joyce would wage against censorship and his attempts to see Ulysses published, he first experienced with Dubliners. But I'm going to argue that The Dead is not scrupulously mean. It's really beautiful, and it's festive, and it's poignant, and that film, I think, captures the spirit of it so well. It's a story that captures life at the turn of the 19th century, just as the revolutionary tide of modern life is flooding Ireland's shores, right? So everything is changing. And you see Gabriel and all of the characters talking about those changes. And some of the changes are good, and some of the changes are scary. And the action of the story is set on the final night of the Christmas season, January 6th, the Feast of the Epiphany. And let me go here, give you another slide. As the critic Mary Burke has noted, the day is also celebrated in parts of Ireland as Little Christmas, right? Nollaig na mBan, which literally in Irish does not mean Little Christmas, it actually means Women's Christmas. And Women's Christmas, Nollaig na mBan, is meant to be a day when women get a break from household chores and cooking after the long work of providing for their friends and family during the holiday season. Wouldn't that be nice? I think that's a fantastic tradition, and it's sort of being resurrected, I think, in the contemporary moment. Women are supposed to relax and enjoy one another's company, and the men of the household are put in charge of the day's meal to show their appreciation for the women and their hard labors during the holidays. So it's primarily a tradition, as Mary Burke notes, that centered around Cork, so it wasn't all of Ireland, but Joyce's father was from Cork, and Burke argues that Joyce would likely have been familiar with this other signification of the day. Which I think is very cool. And of course, we don't see this being enacted in The Dead. We see the opposite of this. We see the women of the Morkan household, running themselves ragged to provide for the family here at the very end. And I'm really drawn to this reading of The Dead. And I'll give you a picture there of 15 Usher's Island. I'm really drawn to it in part because I'm really interested in the way that hospitality is represented in Irish literature. And I'm really interested that the party is taking place in these rented rooms above the corn factor's office on Usher's Island. And it's such a beautiful representation of the problem of Irish hospitality. And of course, we get Gabriel in his speech sort of talking about Irish hospitality. Gabriel Conroy, Julia and Kate Morkan's nephew, is treated like the most honored of guests. Right? Like Joyce, Gabriel is a scholar of modern languages, someone who values his time on the continent to the exclusion of Ireland. Irish is not his language, he tells the nationalist Miss Ivers, Molly Ivers. who calls him a West Briton for publishing reviews in a unionist paper. Gabriel is suspicious of women, including his wife in the story. He's embarrassed in the story, and we see a little bit of that in the film where his face kind of clouds a little bit, but it's made more evident in the story that his cousin Mary Jane's complicated piano performance sort of embarrasses him. And he fears that the speech he has written will not be understood by the friends and family who have gathered in his aunt's home because they're simple people, except that we know that they're not, right? We see them in their amazing understanding of art and music. And culture. So Gabriel kind of bungles every interaction he has with women in the story. He's not a particularly likable character because of his arrogance. But readers often empathize with his lack of self-confidence, right? He's so nervous. He's such a mess. And although he is clearly loved and admired by his family, Gabriel puts the wrong foot forward with just about everyone. And that is less obvious, I think, in the film than in the book, than in the story. As the patriarch of the family, he is called upon to make a speech and to carve the goose. But what Joyce is careful to reveal very early in The Dead, in the very first paragraphs that are told from the housemaid Lily's point of view, the women of this household truly rely upon themselves and have done so for 30 years since the death of their brother Patrick, when they had to leave the middle-class house in Stony Batter that they grew up in, and they have to move to the corn factors. They move to these rented rooms in this industrial part of the city. They hold this party every year for their friends, family, and music students. They insist upon the best of everything, an elaborate feast, a much more elaborate feast, I think, in the book than we even see in the film. And even though they insist upon this, even though unlike most middle-class women of their era, Julia, Kate, and Mary Jane had been forced to work for a living and live in rented rooms, right? They don't own these rooms. The men of their family have let these women down. And the patriarch, the head of this family, is Gabriel, right? He gets to carve the goose, but he's done very little to support these women. And so when he talks at the end of the story, when he thinks at the end of the story about what little part he has played, there's a kind of coming to terms with a failure of kind of 19th century expectations for men and the way that they're supposed to be taking care of women. Because obviously, these women have had to band together to take care of each other and have done so, precariously. And as we see in the story, the Pope has said, women should not be in the choirs. Women should not be paid, to be part of the music arrangements for the church. And this is going to put them out a bit. That basically it's going to be a loss of income for Mary Jane, who has the organ in the Haddington Road. Mary Jane is their orphan niece, right? She's an unmarried woman in her 30s. We're told that she's both a gifted concert pianist and the, quote, main prop of the household. Because she has that organ in the Haddington Road, that job. Mary Jane has taken on the burden of living with and caring for her elderly aunts and is now a spinster, unlikely to marry or have a family of her own. And Gabriel Conroy can carve the goose, but it is Mary Jane who put that goose on the table, right? So she's the true head of the household. Joyce will not let us forget that. Gabriel Conroy has failed to be the kind of man who can be relied upon to protect the women in his family. He's allowed his aunts to fend for themselves because women and their struggles are largely invisible to him, right? He just doesn't see it. And they love him anyway. And he gives a nostalgic speech praising the tradition of Irish hospitality and denigrating hyper-educated people like Miss Ivers who want things to change. But Joyce is alluding to the failure of such hospitality to protect women like the Morkan sisters from a hard life of keeping themselves afloat. And he is also, of course, at the same time, suggesting that Irish hospitality towards the English, remaining part of the empire, comes at too high a cost. And Gabriel can't see it. But once again, readers see it because Joyce wants us to see it. So his treatment of women in these stories is a gateway into a lot of these issues. So Gabriel wants to have that masculine privilege remain unchallenged. But he's had some issues there, right? We see that happen first in the story when he has that awkward encounter with Lily, where he jokes about her future wedding, and she cuts him short. The men that is now is all palaver and what they can get out of you. And he's like taken aback, right? Because she's so bitter and so unhappy. And we're told, and we see this in the film as well, that she is, she's not the girl she used to be. And a lot of critics have read in that the suggestion that Lily has been impregnated and abandoned by a lover, and that, or something terrible similarly has happened to her, that her failed romance then gets linked with Greta's tragic early romance and the death of Michael Fury, that idea of the delicate young man from the gasworks who she fears has died for love of her, which, of course, to anybody reading that story in 1914 is going to echo the words of Yeats and Lady Gregory's Kathleen de Houlihan, the hero, the poor old woman of that play, that very nationalist play from 1901, where young men are called to die for Ireland. So the idea of dying for Greta is tied up and echoes a kind of nationalist sentiment as well. And so Joyce is associating Greta with the Gaeltacht, with the Irish-speaking west of Ireland, and the places that were the hardest hit by the famine, and with Galway, right? Arguably the most Irish of Irish cities in comparison to Dublin. And so it brings with it a lot of symbolic weight. Greta isn't just Greta who has had a lost love. She's also maybe an embodiment of Ireland. And so what is Joyce doing here with Greta? The Lass of Aughrim, the song that Michael Fury sang to Greta and that Bartel D'Arcy sings at the party, is a folk song about a failed romance in which a peasant girl has been seduced by a lord, and she brings her baby to the castle door but is sent away. So it's odd that Michael Fury would have chosen that song to sing to Greta, but given its subject matter, but reflects the predicament of a possibly pregnant Lily, and maybe even a predicament that maybe Greta herself, potentially could have experienced when their romances failed. Right? Greta is sent to the convent school in Dublin, as was Nora Barnacle, who had not just one but two dead young boys in her past, and she was known in school as a man killer because she had these tragic stories of these men who died for love of her. Nora Barnacle was a fountain of inspiration for Joyce, and I think a lot of this movement across the country of these young women, and it's a pretty big thing to leave Galway in 1904 and go all the way to Dublin. It's still a fairly long journey across the width of the country. It echoes the circumstances of a lot of young Irish girls who left their homes in the 19th and early 20th century to serve as domestic servants, as maids in Anglo-Irish big houses within Ireland, and then many of them left to go to England and the United States and served as maids in the United States, and it actually gave them an income and a certain kind of social mobility. A little bit of they would send money home. Irish girls, their ability to travel across the sea and start new lives in new places is opened doors for those women, and so I think Joyce echoes that here. So in many ways, Greta is also a sort of domestic servant, right? Because she's largely invisible. She's largely in the background of Gabriel's life until he becomes aware of how little he knows her and how little he loves her, following that unexpected revelation about the death of Michael Fury. So, Gabriel and his mental anguish seem to take center stage within that story, but we find out a lot about the women, as I'm suggesting, and I think that's because Joyce wants us to. He puts it there for us. His masterful use of free and direct discourse, right? The way in which that third-person narration shifts from character to character so that we are in the head of Lily at the beginning of the story, that we get her perspective on her surroundings, is really impressive. It's one of the kind of notable features of the story. And I think it's really important, that we learn all of these things about these women from outside of Gabriel's perspective. So at the end of the story, right, what's going to happen to Gabriel, we don't know, right? It ends ambiguously. He says that it's time for him to go west. And of course, going west could mean embracing his heritage and embracing the Irish language and embracing, a nationalist future. Or it could mean Tír na nÓg. It could be going west to death, the land of death, right, in Celtic myth. It could mean America, right? There's a lot that gets wrapped up in terms of Irish symbolism, within the story, thinking about what Gabriel will decide to do, having had this revelation of his own kind of uselessness. But I'm going to turn at the very end here of my talk, because I want to make sure. Oh wait, let me see if I've forgotten my slides already. Oh, I did, didn't I? Yeah, there's Gabriel's generous tears, and the end of the dead, and the snow. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit here. I'm going to shift for a moment about the women of Ulysses. And I'm not going to be able to go into any kind of detail because, it's pretty much the end of the talk. We're almost out of time. But I want to talk a little bit for a moment about how Joyce's work in Ulysses reveals his maturing insight into the struggles of women. And one of the most difficult episodes of Ulysses is Oxen of the Sun, right? Takes place in the National Maternity Hospital, the Mater Hospital in Dublin on Hollis Street, where Leopold Bloom's friend, Mina Purefoy, is in labor. And a group of medical students, including Stephen Dedalus, are also in attendance in an adjacent corridor, right, having a bit of a party. And Joyce writes this episode in a pastiche of literary styles that represent the development of the English literary tradition. And it's parceled into 3 sections that are kind of like the 3 trimesters of a pregnancy, offering literature as a kind of parallel work of generation that mirrors a woman's work in childbirth. But Leopold Bloom, we love Leopold Bloom, right? His thoughts and sympathies are with women and mothers. And he's worried about Stephen, right? He's concerned about people. He shows empathy for women. He thinks of the pain of labor and Mina Purefoy's struggle to give birth to her son makes him think of the birth of his own children. Millie, who was born in 1889 and had just turned 15 the day before, and Rudy, who had been born in December of 1893 but dies 11 days later in January of 1894. So, a decade prior to the novel. So all of these things are going through Leopold Bloom's mind, right? The loss of his son and his daughter growing up, and the fact that his daughter has left school, and that we find out that she's probably had her first sexual encounter, that she's now moved out of the family home to be a photographer's assistant down by the seashore. And he's thinking about the lack of intimacy between himself and Molly since the death of Rudy. And how he's staying out of the house to stay away because Blazes Boylan, her lover, will be there that day. And so formally, Oxen of the Sun gives us this tradition of English letters as the domain of men, right? But significantly then, we get Leopold Bloom sort of thinking about women and their situation. And it's a kind of counter to that idea that this is all just about men. And of course, the novel itself ends with Penelope, right? It ends famously with 22,000 words, which I will not read all of them, straight from Molly Bloom's consciousness. And obviously, they're also straight from James Joyce, who is a man's consciousness. But he's trying very hard, right, to kind of channel the thoughts and feelings of Molly Bloom, who is very much like Nora in many ways, right? And so Molly Bloom is literally given the last words of this very long and complicated novel. If you've read Ulysses, it's like it's the treat at the very end. It's probably it's a lot of people's favorite episode of Ulysses. We get her internal monologue organized without much punctuation, but divided. And I'll show you that. I'll go. Divided into 8 sentences. So 22,000 words, and it's 8 sentences. And Joyce used the infinity symbol for this chapter because the infinity symbol looks like the number 8 lying down. And that's why we have 8 sentences at the end of Ulysses. And it looks like a reclining Buddha, which Molly also imagines in her thoughts, right? So she's like, how is Molly like infinity? Because there's an entire universe within her, as we find out in those 22,000 words. What was that? Sorry, what was that? So Molly is the girl from Gibraltar, a daughter of empire, a true cosmopolitan, right? Unlike maybe Gabriel. She's married an Irish-born son of a Jewish father. She doesn't even have to leave her bed to imagine the entire world that she inhabits. She exhibits freedom in body and mind, right? And the novel ends with her reminiscences of the day she became engaged to Leopold. And we get that. And I will end with some of that, right? Well, who was the first person in the universe before there was anybody that made it all? Who? That they don't know. Neither do I. So there you are. They might as well try to stop the sun rising tomorrow. The sun shines for you. And it's a very long passage, so I won't read the whole thing. But at the very end, of course, she imagines herself in Gibraltar, the daughter of, a Spanish mother and Major Tweedy of the army, right? She's in Gibraltar as a girl. She says, Gibraltar as a girl where I was a flower of the mountain. Yes, when I put the rose in my hair like the Andalusian girls used. Or shall I wear a red? Yes. And how he kissed me under the Moorish wall. And I thought, well, as well him as another. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again. Yes. And then he asked me, would I? Yes. To say yes. My mountain flower. And first I put my arms around him. Yes. And drew him down to me so he could feel my breasts all perfume. Yes, and his heart was going like mad, and yes, I said, yes, I will. Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you.